Welcome back to the OHSU Effect. I'm Lacey Evans, and we're going to continue our brain theme now with OHSU professor and neuroscientist, Dr. Larry Sherman. Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, the plan is to talk about music and the brain, but first, let's start with your role at OHSU. What do you do?
I'm a neuroscientist. I do research on multiple sclerosis and Alzheimer's disease and related conditions where the brain becomes damaged.
So yeah, you mentioned multiple sclerosis. Tell me a little more about that.
So a couple of years ago, we made a pretty interesting discovery. When people have damage to the brain, such as happens in multiple sclerosis, the sugar molecule builds up in the brain, and this molecule seems to prevent the repair that would normally happen in the brain. And we think that if we get rid of the sugar or change its activity, we might be able to promote brain repair in MS and possibly other conditions too, including normal aging, Alzheimer's, possibly even stroke.
Yeah, you do some work with learning and memory. What are you finding there?
Well, that's sort of an offshoot of that research. It turns out that this same sugar molecule, which is called hyaluronic acid, is also present in places where stem cells in the brain reside. And these stem cells, it turns out, are really very important for learning and memory. And if these become disrupted, then you actually will affect learning and memory. This happens, for example, in patients on long-term chemotherapy.
So, yeah, let's talk more about, I guess, actuality and what it means for patients with multiple sclerosis or with memory conditions or conditions that damage the brain.
So one of the things we're trying to do right now is develop drugs that influence this molecule, this hyaluronic acid, and the way it signals in the brain. We think that if we can perturb that somehow, mess it up in the cells, that we might be able to get the brain to repair itself in the case of multiple sclerosis and these other diseases. And in the case of patients undergoing cancer chemotherapy, for example, we might be able to give them this other drug before they go on chemotherapy and prevent them from having learning and memory problems that often occur with chemotherapy and other types of treatments.
Yeah, I wasn't aware that memory loss was a side effect of chemotherapy.
Yeah, very few people are, but it is. And in fact, we're going to be having maybe 20 million survivors of cancer. We're getting really good at keeping them alive, but the problem is we have side effects to these treatments that we give them, and this is one of them.
Well, let's talk about your other area of research, music and the brain. I mean, talk about those presentations that you make.
Well, it's actually not an area where I do personal research, but more where I read articles and critically evaluate them. And I was asked several years ago by a colleague to give a talk about music and the brain to a group. And it's become this sort of wild thing where I go out and talk about these studies. And it's really quite remarkable. We know now that playing music, for example, has really amazing physical effects on the brain and functional effects on the brain that are very beneficial.
Well, do you have some examples? Like, I mean, is there a certain time when you're listening to music that people do better, like maybe studying or running or something like that?
Well, for listening to music, it can really enhance your attention depending on the type of music you're listening to. So if you're listening to, Led Zeppelin at full blast and trying to get something done, it's probably not going to work. But if you listen to some other types of music just to kind of wake up your brain and then go off and do something, it's remarkable how much your attention is enhanced. Playing music, on the other hand, seems to have some really remarkable effects for people who are just developing, for kids, for example, but also for the elderly, in kind of enhancing brain function long term. And this is really, really remarkable.
So let's talk about love and the brain. I know you've given some presentations about that as well.
I actually got together and collaborated with Valerie Day. This was her idea, a singer in town who came up with this notion to do a cabaret about brain chemistry for lovers. And that's also turned into another talk that I give to folks. And that's incredible because we're now finding out that for each stage of love, there are specific things that happen in the neurochemistry of the brain, anywhere from the infatuation phase to the rejection phase to the commitment phase. And what's even more remarkable is that there are specific genes that seem to predict, for example, whether or not you're going to become a committed partner versus someone who's going to fool around a lot. So it's really quite remarkable. What we're learning is so much beyond what we ever thought was true 10 years ago.
So we're predisposed to be committed or promiscuous, if you will.
There are some hints that may be true. And in fact, this all came from, believe it or not, research on prairie voles. Prairie voles, it turns out, unlike other voles, these rodents are very committed. The males are very committed. They help rear the young. And it turns out it's one specific gene that seems to decide that. If you put that gene into other rodents that are not particularly faithful, they'll become that way. And that's just incredible.
So what are some things that excite you about the neurological research that's going on today? And what excites you about the future?
To me, right now, the neuroscience field is kind of where the computer industry was about 10 years ago. We're kind of getting on that exponential slope where we're discovering new things at a really incredible pace. the fact that we can image the brain, to me, is one of the most remarkable things, that we can see changes in the brain that are affecting, for example, Alzheimer's onset or multiple sclerosis in ways that we never could before is incredible to me. Those types of discoveries are leading to new questions that we couldn't have imagined before and new ideas. The other area for me, and my lab is personally pursuing, is this idea that neural stem cells exist in our brains and can be used for therapeutics or can be changed around even in the brain itself to help enhance learning and memory, for example, which we talked about earlier.
Well, great. Well, OHSU professor and neuroscientist Dr. Larry Sherman, thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you.
And of course, he is here because we're talking about the brain and the new Body Worlds exhibit that's opening up at OMSI October 20th. This is the OHSU Effect on FM News 101 KXL.